Hi, good evening, and welcome to Bookstock 2020. We're here in Woodstock, Vermont, where we usually hold our annual Bookstock Festival. And this is our 12th year of presenting. And we hope you'll join us this year, of course, but next year when we'll be back in person. I am a person and I am live and I am here. But as you know, we're coming to you remotely. And let's see, our author tonight is Jason Lutes. And before we get to Jason, I just want to let you know that we'll be using a webinar format tonight. So we won't be seeing one another. We'll just be seeing Jason, and in some cases, Carrie Moich, who will be our moderator this evening. So what you can do, though, is you can use the chat function or the Q&A to ask questions, and Jason will do his best to answer them kind of as he goes, or we can kind of circle back at the end if there's questions that we haven't answered yet. So without too much further ado, do come visit us in Woodstock in the future, and check our website, bookstockvt.org, for our next upcoming authors. And I now like to bring you Carrie Moich, who is the owner of Yankee Bookshop in Woodstock, and they are the oldest continually open bookshop in Vermont. Carrie?
Hey. Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Moich, and I am one of the co-owners of the Yankee Bookshop here in Woodstock, Vermont. We are alive and well in the time of COVID, open to the public, and now with a ramped up website that allows us to easily process your orders from anywhere, which we have been doing for these last few months. And we and every other independent business out there thank every one of you for your support during these very strange times. I was particularly honored to help out with an introduction for Jason this evening. Something I think we can all agree on. As a book person, I love stumbling onto an amazing book that I didn't previously know about. And the longer I've been a bookseller, the harder it is to surprise me. But luckily, it does still happen from time to time. Close to 4 years ago, when Christian and I had moved down to Woodstock to take over the bookstore, I went to West Lebanon to get an oil change, and I forgot my reading material. So I had a happy excuse to stop into Newbury Comics and ask for a recommendation, which is something that I love doing. And the young person who was working there that day very quickly recommended this book, Berlin Book One. And they had recently taken a class with Jason, and they thought that it was something that every comic book lover should read at some point, which was a good enough recommendation for me. So I purchased the book and went over to Jiffy Lube to wait for my car, and that was the fastest oil change of my life. I didn't want to put the book down and go back outside. Because I was immersed from the first page, and I've been an advocate for this trilogy ever since. Jason Lutes is a cartoonist and a game designer who lives here in Vermont, where he teaches at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And among his published work is the graphic novel Berlin, a portrait of the German city during the rise of fascism, which has been published in 15 different languages and was the recipient of the Vermont Book Award in 2019. This epic volume took him over 20 years to write and draw, and we cannot wait to hear all about it this evening. It is with great pleasure that I now hand things over to Jason Lutes.
Thanks, Carrie. Wow, I'm so happy to hear that I kept you company at Jiffy Lube that time. I got a recommendation from a Newbury Comics employee. That's an honor. That's a special kind of honor, having been in that shop many times and never thinking that they liked my kind of comics, but I guess one of my students was working there. Hi, everybody. I just first want to thank Allison and Meg and Pam and everyone else at Bookstock for making this possible and for carrying on in the midst of a need to be isolated from one another. It's very heartwarming to know that in our lovely state of Vermont, people love books enough to want to keep doing these great events. Thanks to Carrie and Christian at the Yankee Bookshop. If anyone tuning in has not visited the Yankee Bookshop, it is a wonderful independent bookstore We go there whenever we can, whenever we need. I think the most recent thing I bought there was a collection of Hergé's Tintin. They have a great graphic novel section, and it's a joy to peruse their shelves anytime you're in Woodstock. So highly recommended. It's very strange to be talking to a screen by myself, but I see a list of names here, which tells me that there are at least 40 plus people watching. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to say hi to all of you individually. I want to pretend I'm looking out at an audience of people and I can make eye contact. I see a couple names I recognize, like Jen, hello Jen, and Kurt, hi, and some other folks I think I know. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. Mainly I'm going to talk about the process that got me to make this book. And there'll be an opportunity for questions if anybody has them. I have the Q&A window open. So if you want to if I'm talking about something and you want to just pipe in with a question that's apropos of the moment, please do so, and I'll try to answer it as I go, so that I'm not just like yammering on alone for 40 minutes. It should take about 40 minutes, I hope, and then I'll answer questions directly. But if anything does occur to you in the midst of this, just let me know. Okay, so I am going to do the old screen share, and you should now all be seeing a slide with the title of my book cover on it. Yeah, so these kinds of events that I've been doing lately have been in support of, in promotion of this book Berlin, which I spent a good part of my life writing and drawing. It's the story, oops, sorry, a little twitchy there. As Carrie briefly sort of summarized, it is the story of, well, it's a pretty broad cast of characters. I think by the end of the book, there were something like 8 sort of primary characters, and then a whole cast of 20 to 30 secondary characters that show up in the course of the story. And it's an attempt by me to create a portrait of the city Berlin, the German city Berlin, between the years 1928 and 1933. So in the course of doing that, I created 2 main characters, which you see here on the right-hand page, Kurt Severing and Martha Müller. And the first chapter, from which this page spread is drawn, follows both of them into the city on a train. My feeling was that I wanted to take the reader into the city just like them. For Marta, it's her first time to the city, so I was thinking of her as the kind of eyes and ears of the reader going out onto this stage, I guess. I thought about it very much like sort of winding up characters and setting them free on this stage, which I had spent a lot of time researching. And the goal was to explore what this place was like in this period of time. So in the course of that exploration, I tried consciously to shift perspectives and show people from different walks of life. I tried to show everybody from people that were living on the street to wealthy industrialists and people in between. So that required sort of I think the greatest act of imagination that I tried to accomplish in this book was imagining this variety of lives and lifestyles. So that's one of the things I was attempting to do. I can't really write a story about Weimar Germany without touching on World War I and its horrific legacy, what the war did. It was basically World War I represented the industrialization of warfare to a pretty horrific degree, and the kind of the psychic trauma that that followed it, that kind of hung over all of Europe in its wake, had a real impact on the people living at that time. So there are a couple of flashbacks that go back to World War I. One of my sets of characters is a Jewish family who are basically trying to assimilate into German culture, and the young son of this family, David Schwartz, is kind of representative of that effort as he tries to figure out how to get along in a place which is very hostile to him, while he's also kind of wrestling with his relationship with his father. And it's impossible to write a story that takes place in this time without addressing the political situation, which was very much being physically enacted in the streets between warring gangs representing different political perspectives, the two most dominant ones being the National Socialists and the Communists, who would often get into actual knockdown, drag-out fights in the street. But there were, over 20, I forget the exact count now, but over 20 different political parties in the Reichstag at the time. And any one of them could have had street fighters acting on their behalf. But the biggest fights were between the National Socialists, aka the Nazis, and communists. So a fair amount of that happens within the pages of this book. At one point culminating in the May Day demonstrations of 1929, wherein the Communist Party, in violation of a citywide ban on demonstrations, proceeded ahead with theirs and was intercepted by the police, by the Berlin police force, and in the ensuing chaos, a number of demonstrators were killed. I don't think I need to tell you that having written this book and then publishing it, the book was published, I was writing the last chapter during the 2016 elections, and words can't really describe the combination of horror and fascination I went through, and am still experiencing as I saw this period in history, which I spent so much time studying and trying to reflect, being enacted on our very real streets outside our houses. On a slightly lighter note, Berlin at the time was also known for its nightlife. A city is a place where people from other places gather together, and if you don't belong somewhere in your small rural community and you're of a certain mindset, you can move to a city and find other people that share that mindset. And so it's where communities of LGBTQ people cropped up, and artists and musicians could all find each other, and out of that combination and kind of friction of creative energy, new things could be made. There's a question here from Stephen Shama. The obvious question: why this story? What was fascinating to you about this time in the history of the world? And I'll get to that in the course of what I'm talking about. Steve, thanks for the question. Yeah, so the nightlife, and then for better or worse, in the world of comics, I'm known as the guy who draws buildings. In order to immerse myself in the place, having never been there, and in fact, I didn't visit the actual city of Berlin until I was 200 pages into the story. I found every single scrap of visual reference that I could about the buildings that existed then that don't exist anymore, and used them to create the various backgrounds and situations in which my characters could move. So there's a lot of architecture in my comic, but I don't particularly enjoy drawing it, but I put a lot of time and effort in it to make it a believable kind of fictional space for my characters to inhabit, which is why there's a lot of it in there. Yeah, so that's a bit about the book, and now I'll talk a little bit about why I got there, how I got there, the process that took me there to embark on that project. Starting in a different city, in a different part of the world, lovely Missoula, Montana, where I grew up until the age of 10. In downtown Missoula, there was a combination magazine and comic book and smoke shop called Garden City News, where my dad would take me every Saturday. I would have my weekly allowance, and he needed to go buy tobacco for his pipe, so he would take me downtown Missoula to this little shop, where I would go inside and cross the creaky wooden floors to the back corner, which looked like this. This is just an image I found on the internet, but it pretty much encapsulates the feeling of going back into the back corner of this store and being surrounded by this crazy, what Charlie Brown called a great gory selection of colorful comic books and magazines. And I would spend an hour just lying on the floor. The owners were great. They let you just chill out and read comics That's what I would do when my dad was doing other errands around town. And then when he came back, I'd have to decide how to spend my 50 cents that week, which more often than not was on mainstream American superhero comics, many of which would of course go on to be blockbuster movies in the Cineplex. And I also liked Westerns a lot. It was a strange irony that I was the son of an academic. My dad taught French literature at the University of Montana. And I lived in Montana. I lived in the land of cowboys. And but that's not the life I led. We were very far from being on a ranch. And I was fascinated by the kind of romance of the cowboy. I think I was also fascinated by the fact that they all seem to be kids, as you can tell by the covers of these comics. So I think as a 10-year-old, there was and obviously the publishers are really trying to get you to, as a young boy, to buy their comics by having their characters be kids, at least in name. So these were fascinating to me as well at the time. My dad taught at the University of Montana, and so I love these mainstream American, colorful, action-oriented comics, but those were kind of looked down upon by most. So there was a point at which those kinds of comics were called the marijuana of the nursery in our country, because of the horrible things that they would do to the minds of children. But among my dad's peers, these other literature and humanities professors, there were comics that were okay for you to read. And the reason that they were okay is because they came from Europe. They weren't sold on the newsstand. These were comics you had to buy in actual bookstores. Bookstores like the Yankee Bookshop, by the way. Of course, I was fascinated by Tintin. Hergé, the creator of Tintin, formulated I should say he manufactured a formula for making an incredibly readable, incredibly appealing comic book. These Tintin comics like almost read themselves. They're so well made. And my dad and his colleagues were encouraging of children to read these books, and would even buy them with their own money and give them as gifts, ignoring the fact that more people get shot and killed in Tintin comics than in any American comics, because Tintin's always running up against opium gangs and whatnot. There's actually quite a lot of violence in Tintin comics, but it's all depicted in this very kind of colorful. It all seems very, very safe, even though that people are getting shot and killed, and other disturbing things happen. But they're amazing, amazing books, and were a huge, huge influence on me growing up. This is a drawing, a self-portrait I've made of myself when I was 9 or 10 years old. And the crazy thing about this drawing, which my mom was cleaning out her garage and sent to me when she found it, is how much of it is true. It was me imagining, as you can see in the upper right there, it says Jason Lutes, grown up. And then there's there's expressions of belief there. But what's fascinating to me is if you look at the left side of this, there's a drawing table, and there's a page from a Spider-Man comic on that drawing table. So I'm working on Spider-Man. I'm imagining myself being a cartoonist as an adult. Next to that, pinned on the wall, is a memo that says, from Marvel Comics to Jason L., deadline June 3rd. So I've got a deadline for this comic book. It's due on June 3rd. And if you look at the calendar on the wall, you can see that it's crossed out up to June 7th. So I've missed my deadline. If you look at the far right on the floor, there's a little note that my landlord left me. It says rent due June 1st. So my rent's past due. I am a cartoonist who's missed a deadline, and I need to get on that as fast as possible. I'm accepting food donations, so I imagine being a starving artist as well at the time. Also, apparently June has 13 days in it. I don't think I understood like how long a month was. And the last little note about this drawing, this prophetic drawing, I either predicted my future or created my future by making this drawing. And I had completely forgotten about it until my mom gave it to me. But you can see that I'm wearing glasses. And I didn't get glasses until I was 15. So I was even imagining that part of my life. yeah, so the other thing that happened in Missoula, Montana, in 1977, when I was 10, was this. It wasn't until much later that I would understand the full impact of Star Wars. There's a question, how old were you when you made that drawing? I was 10. That was, I made that in same year that Star Wars came out, 1977. This movie, when it came out, of course, caught my imagination, like everybody else in the country, especially boys around my age. And I went and saw it in the movie theater 22 times that summer. And the reason being, of course, that there was no other way to watch a movie than if you saw it in the movie theater. You couldn't even rent a VHS tape at that time. So I spent all my allowance that summer on going back to watch Star Wars. And I wouldn't really understand its impact on my storytelling and my approach to narrative until much later, but it did have an impact. My parents got divorced around then. My mom picked up my brother and my sister and I and moved to a suburb of San Jose, California. A shapeless suburb like many of the others at the time. And this was a very strange environment to be in after kind of living in the kind of hills and forests of Montana. My first day of 5th grade, I came home and walked into the wrong house because they all looked the same. And I didn't realize until I had gotten in there. I came inside, put my backpack down, went to the fridge to get some food out, and then thought the fridge looked weird, and then opened up and saw there was like leftover Chinese food and other stuff that we would have never had in our fridge. And then I heard footsteps upstairs and ran out of the house. Which is just to say that like I felt very lost in the suburbs of California. And I would have continued to feel lost, I think, unless I had found, anyway, Dungeons and Dragons saved me, is all I'm trying to say. I'm sure you've heard of this game. It's a kind of the crackpot invention of a couple of Midwesterners. It's a game where you sit down with your friends and tell a story together. And it totally opened up my mind to creative possibility. Did a number of things that had a huge impact on my creative efforts afterwards. It helped me empathize with people, because one of the things you have to do in this game is pretend you are other people, especially if you're the person who's kind of running the game. When you're the quote unquote dungeon master, one of your jobs is to be all the characters, all the secondary characters. And in the course of doing that, you have to sort of think about how those people would behave and act. So it taught me empathy. I mean, I think there's other things in my life that did a better job of teaching me empathy, but this made it a regular part of my creative life to imagine other people's existence. And it was really wonderful in the fact that it was collaborative and improvisational, because you would sit down with your friends and you'd basically make up a story together. So it really kind of broadened my notion of what a creative endeavor could look like and how to tell a story. This is what it looked like to play D&D. This is, again, an internet image, but the kid in the blue shirt on the right there is a dead ringer for me at the age of between 12 and 15, when I was heavily into playing Dungeons and Dragons. This is very much what it looked like in any one of my friends' houses at the time, as we all stayed up to all hours of the night, drinking sugary soft drinks and eating too much junk food, and telling stories together. So yeah, I look like the kid on the right, but I wish I was the guy on the left there, because he's a real life wizard as far as I'm concerned. I got out of high school, got to the end of high school. I've been drawing comics, but like never a finished story, just like, you know, a page here or there. I was torn between wanting to go study writing and wanting to go study art. You know, very lucky to be in a privileged position where I could had those options. In the end, I decided to go try my hand at art, because I felt like when comparing those two things, which I thought of as separate, I seem to have a stronger grasp of art. I seem to be better at it. So I decided that would be the thing to focus on. So I applied to one art school and got in. And I think it took me like 10 or 15 years to pay off the debt from this art school, but it was really worth it. It was an amazing experience to go to the Rhode Island School of Design down in Providence. Dungeons and Dragons opened my mind to the possibility of storytelling. The Rhode Island School of Design opened my mind to the possibilities of expression through art, through different media. Had a really, really great time there. Amazing teachers, amazing fellow students. But I went there because it was time to get serious about art, and that meant studying fine art. That meant putting aside comics, which of course were for kids. That's the way we thought of them. And it was time to get real about being a serious artist. Luckily, within a very short period of time, I think within the first year, I was disabused of that notion when I found this book, Read Yourself Raw, in the RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design bookstore. This is an anthology put out by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. You can see their names down at the bottom there. And the amazing thing about this book, this is a collection of stories from a series, an anthology series that they produced. It drew artists from different parts of the world. There were a lot of European artists and artists from other countries in here, and they were making anything but mainstream American comics or Tintin. It was, each one of the stories in this book was different from every other story in it, and each one represented a very idiosyncratic, very specific and strong perspective, a very strong personality. And each one was unique in the way that it used words and pictures to tell those stories. So Raw magazine showed me that comics, in fact, are art, and that all comics is, when it gets right down to it, is words and pictures. That's it. There's no genre associated with comics. It's just a medium. And saying that now, it seems obvious, but in 1989, it was not. And I credit Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly for broadening people's perception, and certainly mine in that regard. Here they are, Art and Françoise. This is, I think, at the publication of the first half of his book, Mouse. And you can see Art's wearing his Raw t-shirt there. So Art and Françoise really had a big impact on my choices, my development as a cartoonist. Around that time, after I got into Raw, I started looking at other things that were out there. One of them was a series of comics by a Canadian cartoonist named Chester Brown. The thing that I learned from looking at Chester Brown's comics was that comics can be quiet. When you have panels where nothing happens, there's no action, there's nobody talking, it's just a character in an environment, or maybe it's just a picture of an object. In those moments, the reader gets to enter into the comic and decide for themselves what's happening, what the character's feeling, and draw connections. By doing that, by creating space for the reader to enter, comics becomes much more interactive. And I learned that you don't have to spell everything out, that you can be subtle, that you can be suggestive, and that it's not always important that you communicate a clear and obvious message. Sometimes mystery and kind of emotional nuance come through in these moments. I also encountered the work of Ben Catchor, who's a New York cartoonist. He did a weekly strip about a real estate photographer named Julius Knippel, and his comics taught me, each one of his little comics, his weekly strips, was like a little poem, was a little ode to some small detail of city life. And they're very gentle and humorous, and they showed me that comics could be poetic. Around that same time, I walked into a movie theater in Providence, and they happened to be showing Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders. Oddly, it was not. I did not realize until much later how much this movie got into my head. It was my first real encounter with the city of Berlin, visually, like the first time I really saw the city of Berlin. If you don't know this film, it's about, among other things, it's about some angels who walk around the city and they can listen in on people's thoughts. There's a very, sort of the weight of history hangs over Berlin in this story. And this idea of listening in on people's thoughts, you can see how it relates to comics because of the idea of thought balloons. So, and that happens a lot in my book, Berlin. So looking back, I realized that Wings of Desire had a huge impact on me. I thought a lot about, when I first started touring around for my book and thinking about my influences, there were a lot of visual influences and cartoonists who came to mind readily, but when I thought about writers, the two big ones for me were Ursula Le Guin who does a lot with very little. She's not with us anymore, unfortunately, but brilliant, incredibly smart writer who, I don't know if you read this book, it's a very thin volume, but she conjures up an entire world from the sparest, most economical use of language. Really incredible book, and one of these books that the less she writes, the more your imagination fills in the gaps. And then another big influence on me was William Faulkner. I read a book of his out loud with my girlfriend in college, and we took turns reading chapters. We traded off, and As I Lay Dying, by the way, it's not a great date book. As you can imagine, it's about somebody who's dying, but we read the whole thing out loud together, and we were several chapters in, and it was my turn to read, and I was reading a paragraph, and the words, I was just saying the words out loud, and I lost track of the meaning of the words, of the content of the words, and all of a sudden something kind of cracked open inside of me, and I just broke down and started crying. And I couldn't explain, I couldn't say why, but one thing I did know, I mean, there was nothing in the story itself that made me cry, but there was something about the sound of the words themselves, the way that Faulkner put together these sentences to create this emotional effect, almost regardless of their content. Which is to say that I very much believe the written language is a kind of magic, and that William Faulkner cast a kind of spell over me, which is to say, William Faulkner, real life wizard. This is a point in the talk when I usually ask people to guess who this woman is in the middle. So I'm just going to throw that out to the audience. I'm not going to wait for an answer. I just say, who is this woman in the middle? She's holding an Academy Award. She won the Academy Award for editing film in 1977. The date's a clue because I've already cued you into it. Her name is Marcia Griffin. She was born Marcia Griffin, and then later she married a guy named George Lucas. She and George Lucas met at film school in Southern California, and she edited the movie that put him on the map, American Graffiti. She edited Taxi Driver, which is considered one of the great American films. Martin Scorsese was stoned out of his mind in New York and couldn't finish this movie, and he called up Marcia and said, hey, will you help me finish my movie? And she flew out to New York, and she did the final edit on Taxi Driver. All of the big filmmakers in the 70s from California thought of Marcia as a troubleshooter, as somebody who would come in and fix their movies if they needed help. If there was a scene that wasn't working, if the structure or flow was off, they would call in Marcia. So there's lots of jobs she did that she's uncredited on, but she came in and worked on a lot of people's movies. She edited New York, New York, another by Martin Scorsese. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Star Wars: A New Hope. Crazy story there, I won't get into it now, but she edited this film. And when I was thinking back on Star Wars and how it impacted me, it is the way that that story is told, not the content, which is, has its own appeal, but it is the way that the story is told. Marcia's job was to choose when and where to cut from one image to the next, and in so doing, create a flow and a feeling from that story. And that was the key, really, because when they did test screenings, whenever there was a scene where people laughed in the test screening, George would say, we have to cut that. And Marcia said, no, they're laughing, we have to keep it, because that's what makes it human. They would laugh at the moments when people did funny things. George was thinking it was a serious science fiction movie, and Marcia was looking for the humanity. And in doing that, helped propel this film to extraordinary success. She edited all of The Empire Strikes Back, and she edited half of Return of the Jedi. If you're a Star Wars nerd, you know there's a good half and a bad half. Oh, what's this? Marcia has some great words of wisdom in the doc about editing called Edge Codes from TVO. Thank you for the tip. I believe that's Warren who said that. Thank you. I will look that up. Brilliant filmmaker, brilliant editor. Was basically written out of the history books, except for a couple of exceptions. She doesn't really show up in the Star Wars documentaries because they had a very acrimonious divorce. George was incredibly heartbroken. She never worked in film again, and people speculate as to why that may be, but it was a great loss, I think, and also the greater loss being that few people really know about her. So I'm happy to hear that one of our attendees here knows about Marcia, and now you all do too. I had a plan to write a book about her one time. I tracked her down to Hawaii. My mom worked some connections, but she is basically a recluse and doesn't want to interact with anybody and talk about her past that way. So I'm not going to bother her, but at least you guys know about her now. Another big influence on me was David Lynch. The thing I ended up deeply admiring about David Lynch is that he trusts his instincts. He's in an incredibly privileged position to be able to do that, but he pays attention to the little voice inside of him and does whatever it says, regardless of whether it abides by convention or not. He follows his intuition to pretty extraordinary results. Yes, and he happens to be a cartoonist. Somebody's noting that the comic strip, The Angriest Dog in the World, was written by David Lynch. So great influence on me as well, mainly for his listening to the inner voice. That's what he showed me. After college, I moved to Seattle, Washington, got a job at a weekly newspaper called The Stranger. It was a free weekly alternative paper. There's a few of them left in the country. The Stranger's still going, actually, all these years later. All right, somebody in Seattle. Excellent. I was asked by the art director at the time to create a comic strip for The Stranger. It was going to be a weekly comic strip. And I thought, wow, what a great opportunity. So in order to do that, I looked back at my influences and the things that had impacted me the most. And of course, I looked at Hergé, who did Tintin. And I thought, what was it about that comic strip that made it so compelling? And I learned that originally Tintin was published 2 pages at a time in a weekly newspaper, just like the one I was going to be working for. So in those 2 pages, seen here the very first 2 pages of Tintin, Hergé had to sort of create the next installment in his story, and then in the lower right-hand corner of each 2-page spread, he would create a little cliffhanger that would make you want to read next week's episode. And that became a kind of metronomic rhythm in all of his stories. This lower right-hand page, if you think about a physical book, you don't see what's on the next page until you turn it. And then you're revealing something. And so he would always create these little cliffhangers in the lower right-hand corner. So I was living in this house and I was thinking about Hergé and what I was going to do. And I had a dream about dancing with somebody and they melted through my arms. And I woke up and I made a little sketch of that. And then I took this image of dancing with someone and having them melt as the starting point for a story that I would write for this newspaper. So taking a cue from David Lynch, this image just came to me and I'm just going to follow it and see where it goes. So it starts off with 2 people dancing together. This is, gosh, 1993, maybe? 92, 93. I looked around my neighborhood and walked the streets of Seattle. I guess our friend from Seattle, you may know this building. It's up on the Capitol Hill at like 16th, and I can't remember the cross street. And I would incorporate aspects of different neighborhoods into the story itself, and I would make it up 1 page at a time. And eventually, at the end of 2 years of doing a page a week, I ended up with a book. This is just multiple editions of the same book, but it's called Jar of Fools, and it was the story of an unemployed magician told improvisationally. After I finished that book, I felt I knew who I was as a cartoonist and that I could kind of do any kind of story I wanted. And in that state of mind, I was reading a magazine one day and I came across an ad for a book called Bertolt Brecht's Berlin. It was just like a half-page ad, and it was an advertisement you could send away. It was mail order. You could send this before the internet. You could send away money for a copy of this book. And I read the little blurb, and the line that I remember is, "And the jazz bands played on as the world spun out of control." And that was a very evocative line to me. And I looked at this ad, and I read that, and I thought to myself, that's it. That's the next thing I'm going to do. So this is answering Stephen Shama's question from earlier. It was a random impulse. Something about this ad spoke to me. I didn't know anything about Berlin, Germany in the 20s, beyond I think I'd seen half of Cabaret at some point. Sent my money in through the mail, and I got a copy of this book. So this was my entree into that world. And then from then I did about 2 years of solid research where all I did was go to used bookstores and libraries, find everything I could lay my hands on, and immersed myself in Berlin in the 20s. Made a point not to read anything after 1933. I didn't want to know anything about the future. I just wanted to imagine being in the city at the time. So that was my basic approach. While somebody has a question here, while you were publishing Jar of Fools, did you have other jobs as an artist or otherwise? Yeah. I ended up being the art director of that same paper that I drew for, and I also washed a lot of dishes, did a lot of temp work. It was definitely a starving artist kind of thing. I made a decision to spend as much time as I could working on my comics, and that meant trying to make ends meet doing other jobs, whatever jobs I could get. So I did a lot of restaurant work, mostly. And then this job at the paper ended up being close to a full-time job. So then I was doing the comic strip and being an art director at the same time there. Yeah, so 2 years of research. And then once the internet came online, I could look up a lot of stuff online. I encountered this amazing novel by Alfred Dublin called Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is a very impressionistic portrait of the city. And I learned a lot from reading that. It's packed full of amazing information. And then I started creating my characters based on everything that I'd read. I would always start with a drawing or a painting or a photograph from the time, and then kind of build out from that. So in the lower left, there's a self-portrait by the artist Katie Kollwitz, and I used her as the basis for my main character, Marta. This is a painting by Konrad Felix Müller of a paperboy, which I used as the basis for David Schwartz. And then some real life people do show up in the story. Joachim Ringelnatz was a poet and performer, and Karl von Ossietzky was an editor of a important arts journal at the time. And then this is a photograph by August Sander, which I used as the basis for my character, Gudrun Braun, who's a working class mom. And then I made lists of things I wanted to have in this book. This is before I'd even drawn the first page. I was spending 2 years of reading about it, taking notes, drawing sketches, and then what's this book going to have in it? What's it going to be about? And as you can see from this ridiculously ambitious, absurdly ambitious list of ideas, there's things like joy, fear, anger, envy, love, sadness, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and the sixth sense. So I wanted to use comics to kind of express the breadth of human experience. That was how old was I? I think I was 26 years old. That was the kind of ambition that I was feeling at that young age. Luckily, that was a good starting point, but luckily it fell by the wayside, and the characters themselves became the story, and I can pay attention to them and not worry about these kind of high concepts. When I started writing the book, I would do it in these what we call thumbnail drawings, just tiny little drawings of each page. It's really important to me to understand how the words and pictures are going to fit together. So that's why I have to work it out this way. And this is where you can see that one on the left is inked, but the one on the right is penciled. So this is, I'd erase and redraw and erase and redraw and erase and rewrite until I got it the way I wanted it to be. And then later I would learn to organize each chapter according to what happens on each page. So I just make a list of page numbers and write down a single sentence that describes what happens on that page. Here you can see these are notes from, at the top it says Berlin number 10, that's chapter 10, July, August 1929. Some notes about, it says, ends with stock market crash 1929, up at the top there. And then on the right, there's a list of the characters that are gonna show up, and I'm kind of trying to figure out what's gonna happen in that chapter. And then I would turn that into a more cleaned up, single kind of bullet point list of what happens on each page. Because in comics, it's about the real estate. You have a specific number of pages off. It doesn't have to be finite, but I like working within constraints. It's not like you're working on a word processor and you just use as many words as you need to. You've got some restrictions. The page spread, and then how many pages you might have in a chapter or individual issue in my case. And then I would take that list and turn it into these little thumbnails. And then I would figure out what I needed to find visual reference for. In this case, in the background, I needed a phone booth and a streetcar. And then I would go through my books of photographs, find phone booths, making sure that it was the right year that this would have been on the street at that time. And then this is what my rough pencils look like as I'm sketching in the background details. And then on my first trip to Berlin, I made a tour of a lot of used bookstores. I found this incredible book of streetcars. And for this particular scene that I needed reference for, I found the actual streetcar that would have run on that street. Just amazingly, it was in here, the one on the bottom there. And then I used that as the basis for the streetcar that shows up in this scene. This scene is an extreme example of like finding the things I needed so that I knew, and looking at maps and whatnot, I knew that basically every thing that happens in the scene was pretty close to true. That wasn't always the case, but this is a kind of extreme example of being successful in my research. So yeah, that's what the rough pencils look like. And then I refine those pencils to clean them up. And then I ink them. And that's what the finished page looks like. I work in black and white because I feel like it's a more direct connection between me and my readers. Like when you pick up my book, it's black ink printed on white paper, and which is the same thing as when I created it. And there's no, when you add color, there's a different, like the printing process is different, and it's not as direct a connection. And I also like the fact that like the white of the page is showing through both within the panels and between the panels. So I feel like it's sort of when there's color inside the panels, they're more separate. So I value the power of black and white for that reason. Thank you for the kind comments in the chat. Yeah, this is an example of how I wrote a sequence. In the course of visual research, I would find things that I hadn't anticipated in my, I might have made notes about how a chapter was going to go or how a story was going to go, and not anticipated things that I encountered in photographs. For instance, in this case, I had found a photograph of this very, very busy intersection in the middle of Berlin. And in the middle of this intersection was this traffic tower, which you can see in the middle here. This is the very first traffic light in Europe, because traffic had got modernity, industrialization, had gotten to the point where there was so much street traffic they needed to get those police who were usually in the street directing traffic up into a safer position and give them some more automation that would help them direct traffic. So there was actually an actual police officer up there pushing buttons to change the colors of the lights and direct traffic. And I found that totally fascinating. So there's just this one page aside where you kind of go into the brain of the guy who's in that traffic tower. So I published this a chapter at a time. These came out as floppy comic books, the kind you think of when you think of a comic book on a newsstand. Back in the day when comic book shops were a little more extant than they are now. A lot of them have shut down for obvious reasons. But there was a time when you could buy my comic book in such a shop. About 3 chapters in, I took a step back and I looked at everything that had come up. As I mentioned, I wrote it largely improvisationally. I did all this research, but then kind of like started to explore, not knowing what was going to happen next. And so at this moment, I took a step back and made lists of things that had arisen: characters, themes, events, things that I felt like I needed to pay attention to as I moved forward. And then I wrote the next 13 chapters. Every time I wrote a new chapter, I'd go back and read the previous ones. So I was constantly reminding myself of where I was at and bringing myself up to date and trying to but still trying to hold on to this kind of make it up as you go kind of feeling, because that's what made it exciting and interesting to me. I didn't know what was going to happen next. And my feeling was if I approach this like an exploration, not knowing, then hopefully that will carry over to the reader, and the reader will wonder what's going to happen next. And then those got collected into 2 books, and between the publication of those 2 books, I got an invitation to come teach comics in Vermont at the Center for Cartoon Studies in lovely White River Junction, a mere, was that 10-15 minutes from Woodstock? Yeah, so I teach at this was, gosh, 13 years ago. and I've been teaching there ever since. I'm still teaching. We have 16 in-person students this year, all socially distanced, all wearing masks in the classroom. We have some who can't fit in the classroom, so each week we do like it's a hybrid classroom where some students are Zooming in, and but it's still going. We're still going strong. This is the graduating class of, gosh, I want to say, I can't remember the year here. I'm not going to make a fool of myself. But wonderful group of people every year. I feel truly honored and really lucky to have this job where I meet a whole new group of aspiring cartoonists every single year. This particular year was really meaningful to me because Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly came to the graduation. Francoise was our commencement speaker. So it brought me right back to the initial inspiration that made it possible for me to even attempt to write the graphic novel that I ended up writing. So that was a really nice moment. Here's a couple more pages of process. I'll wrap this up really soon. So if you have any questions, think about those and plug them into the Q&A or the chat. I think I can respond to both of those. So this is just a little bit more about the process. Some more thumbnails. In this case, I was trying to, I had a scene that took place at the communist headquarters in Berlin, but I didn't know what it looked like yet. So I found this photograph, which is pretty amazing. And then I found where it was on the map. I have a big map of, I still have it up on the wall, of Berlin in 1928. And every scene in the story happens in a specific place. And in this case, I knew that that's where the communist headquarters was. And then at this point, the internet existed, and I could use Google Earth to figure out in modern day Berlin, where that was. And then I could drop down. I could look, if you look at the page on the left, it's a very scratchy page. It's just Kurt, one of my main characters, very slowly moving through the city towards the headquarters. And in that middle panel on the left-hand page, you can see there's a suggested building in the background. And I thought, what if I went on Google Earth and just dropped the little guy into Street View and see what I could see. And this was what I saw back in 2011 from that perspective. So if I go back to that panel, that middle panel, you can see that it's at street level. It's basically at eye level, looking out across the street towards another building. And this is what it looks like today. And I can tell from my research that the buildings in the far back on the left there, especially that glass and steel one, wouldn't have been around, but this darker one in the front with some missing windows was definitely from the period. So I knew that I could include that safely. And you'll notice that blurry shape at the end of it is not detailed at all. So I had to look at other buildings to figure out what it might have looked like, and then came to this conclusion. Somebody asks, Peter asks, did you use visual images in the movie Symphonia der Großstadt, which is in your bibliography? I did not use any actual images from that film. I watched it several times, and I think I watched it. The main thing of that was this, like seeing the city moving. So many things I looked at were stills, and I really, the most valuable thing that film gave me was the sense of activity and life. So it was really important from that perspective. This is what the finished page looks like. And then later on, my main character approaches he's feeling pretty distraught and kind of overwhelmed by what's happening around him, as many of you may feel right now. And so he's considering joining the Communist Party, and that's why he's approaching here. So I wanted it to be very kind of intimidating. And then at the bottom there, you can see this is a rough pencil, and then that gets cleaned up and then tightened up further until I'm happy with it. And then that's what the finished page looks like. And then the last sequence I'll leave you with is the close to the 16th chapter of my book. It ran a total of 22 chapters. And I had some specific events that I knew were going to happen. I mean, it was improvised, but real historical events were going to happen at certain points. And at the end of the 16th chapter is when it's the elections of 1930. And this is when the National Socialists swept into the Reichstag. So on this very last page, there's a voiceover. It's a radio voiceover of an announcement saying the German Communist Party did well with a gain of 23 seats, but the greatest gain goes to the National Socialists, who have stunned observers by taking 95 seats in a landslide victory, raising their stake in the Reichstag from 12 to 107 in one fell swoop, and causing citizens and politicians of Germany alike to ask, what is the future of the Weimar Republic? So I needed to find a picture of the inside of the Reichstag. And I found this amazing photograph. Of course, somebody recorded this very historic moment. And what's extraordinary about this to me, in terms of like visual storytelling, things that you can deduce from an image, is that it's black and white, but you can tell by the gray, this whole gray swath right here. If you look at the color of the clothing on these people in this section, you can see that it's all a lighter shade than everybody else in the room, because of course, those are all the Nazis in their brown shirts. So it's a pretty dramatic image. And so when I found this, like my heart stopped because it was such a clear picture. And of course, when they came in, they had no intention of working within the system. They came in to destroy it and promptly succeeded to do so, which may sound painfully familiar to some of you. I'm not above tracing. You learn a lot from a thing by drawing it, and the same is true of tracing, as long as you're paying attention. The key is to not make it look so much like a photograph that it feels divorced from the rest of your drawing. And my approach to this drawing of this entire book was one of sort of a documentary approach, where I was trying to render things objectively. So I do get away occasionally with a traced drawing here and there. So that was the only way I could tackle that very complicated image, was by tracing that. That's what it looks like on the final page, as two of our characters leave the city for Paris and a better life there. So yeah, in the end, when I was 26 years old, I saw that ad in the magazine and decided to write a 600-page book about Berlin, Germany. And in the end, I think it was 540 pages, so I didn't quite make 600. I was 22 chapters. It took me 22 years. I finished the week before my 50th birthday through a big party, which is to say that self-portrait that I made of myself when I was 10 years old was very, very true. I missed deadlines. I had originally planned to finish by the time I was 40, so I was 10 years late on this book. And that, I think, is the end. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And let's see here. I have a question. Okay, we got some questions here that I'm happy to answer. Did you consider bringing in Christopher Isherwood, the author from which Cabaret came from? Right, Christopher Isherwood's Berlin Stories is the basis for Cabaret. I never considered bringing him in. I really wanted to limit the number of I think there's a kind of great temptation when you're writing historical fiction, when you start to discover things like, oh my gosh, Picasso was there and so-and-so was there, and I got to have them in the story. And I think it's a great temptation. So I tried only to include people that made sense within the story I was trying to tell. I tried to resist the urge to bring somebody in just because I was excited about them, which was hard because a lot of incredible people were present at the time. So I did not bring Isherwood in. When you finally went to Berlin, did it confuse you or compete with or challenge your invented vision of the city? That's a wonderful question. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified because I'd written and drawn 200 pages of this story. My plan was to spend, at the time, I thought, oh, it's gonna take me 14 years. So I'd embarked on this, what a lot of my friends thought was an absurd undertaking. And then I got invited to come to Germany by a publisher who was publishing my first book, Jar of Fools. And I can't turn down that opportunity. One of the reasons I had not traveled is because I couldn't afford to. I was, starving artist. So I had to say yes. And of course, need to see the real place that I'm writing this book about. So I was absolutely terrified, because I thought that the real place would prove what I was doing fraudulent, that the real place would show me up to be a kind of pretender. And I guess in the end, the fun part was I took the train into the city, and the sun was going down, and I got off the train, and the very first thing that struck me was, it's in full color. Like, I was really staggered. I came at a time of year when the trees were all in leaf, and like, it's an incredible city in the spring because everything is green. And you think of it, I thought of it, I'd looked at these black and white photographs of gray, dingy buildings, and I had no idea that how beautiful of a city it is. So that was the first thing that struck me. And then very quickly, I learned that the obvious lesson, which is that my Berlin was just that. It was mine. It was just it was like a city in a shoebox. It was like my little imaginary version of this place. And that my city, I think I had somehow aspired to somehow capture something real. And while I think I may have touched on some things that are real, like the realization that I had was that there's no way a place this rich and alive and full of people and could be really captured. So it was it was a great relief, because I realized, oh, I am a faker. I can just, it's okay. Like, this is just my version of Berlin. And it didn't hurt that the German readers of the book in translation were all very gracious and kind and complimentary. It was a really, really wonderful trip. And it gave me the energy I needed to continue on. What else do we got here? Any secret images in a scene that you place for fun or otherwise, like in Mad Magazine? There's a couple of my friends, my fellow cartoonist friends, show up. There's an art school scene. I guess the whole art school scene was a little bit of a send up of my experience at art school. I had a teacher at art school who, the first day of class, we came in and we had homework our first day of class, and we put up drawings on the wall, and she went around the room and she said, one after another, she would go around the room and she would point at the drawings and say, this is crap, this is crap, this is crap, this is crap. Like, she just made a point of humbling us all the very first day of class. And I still to this day don't really understand the point of that. There's a certain school of art education that thinks you need to like break people down, and I call bullshit on that. But it was very amusing, and so I turned that into a scene in the story. And then some of my cartoonist friends show up there as well. How long does it make a page? How long does it take to make a page? I can do a whole page start to finish in a day, but that's a long day. I can do a page in 6 hours, but that is 6 straight hours of being hunked over my drawing board. I'm always looking for ways to economize and get faster at the process. And I see there's a question from Peter that says, what is your current big project? And that's one of the things I've tried to do, is simplify my process. The pages from Berlin are 11 by 14. I don't have any right here. And as you can see, they're quite detailed. So for my next book, I'm going to work simpler, and I'm drawing much smaller. This is the original size. This is the first page of my next book, which is going to be in color because I want to start playing around with that. And it is a Western that takes place in Arizona in 1865. So it's kind of an action adventure, but it's not about the sheriff and the outlaw. It's about people who were living then at that time who you wouldn't see in the movie version. So that's my next project. And then looks like there's maybe one more question. What's your cat's name? Oh, the cat in the back doesn't have a name. We do have 2 cats, Midnight and Tiger, but that cat doesn't have a name. I'm taking suggestions. And then last questions. As you went along, did you engage with any of the artists who were at work at the time? Gross, Otto Dix, any favorites? Yeah, all of them. I read all of them. I mean, looked at all of them. George Gross was incredibly inspirational, and I wish I could draw like George Gross, but he was big. you know, I admire Otto Dix, but I find his work disturbing to the point where I'm not particularly attracted to it. I don't need things to be aesthetically pleasing, but I think Dix succeeds in being genuinely disturbing in his work. Other people working at the time, I mean, Gross I think is the big one. There's a cartoonist named Heinrich Zilla. Wait, am I getting his first name right? Cartoonist working at the time who did a wonderful job capturing working class life. And then last question, did you find yourself writing visually first? And the answer is no. For me to write comics, they have to happen together. Like the words and the pictures have to, I think about them at the same time. I see the image and I hear the words, or, you know, they're always happening together. But it did take time to learn how to do that. Sometimes I'll start with an image. Sometimes I'll start with maybe a phrase or a line of dialogue, but mostly I'm thinking about both things at the same time. All right. I think that's
Hi
it.
again. Hey, what a talk. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, I have one question for you. Who are you reading right now?
Who am I reading right now? Comics wise, I'm a big fan of Gabrielle Bell, who's a New York cartoonist. This is a book called The Voyeurs. She has a number of books out there actually, but most recently I've been reading that. And then prose wise, I've been reading Charles Portis, who wrote True Grit, which is one of the greatest, funniest American novels and has one of the greatest woman characters written by a man. Incredible book. And the rest of his books are also super funny. The rest of his books are all about old white guys. So they have that, you know, drawback to them because I get a little tired of reading those books, but True Grit is an amazing masterpiece and I like rereading it. And, but I've been reading all of his stuff just because he's just an amazing, hilarious writer. And also N.K. Jemisin, you recommended the fifth, what is it called?
Fifth season.
Fifth season, yes, which is great. Yeah. I really wanted to read some stirring science fiction, even science fiction seems like a wrong category for that. But yeah, so that was a big one that I read recently.
Sorry, it just had a cat jump on the table, so we're okay. But yeah, thank you so much for the talk. You know, we're blessed enough. Christian and I got to hear this last year too when you were at the library in person. So thank you for doing it again. Thank you to Bookstock for putting this on, and for the Norman Williams Public Library for all the work that your organizations have done to give us some entertainment here at home when we can't all meet in person. And I want to encourage everybody to take a look at www.bookstockvt.org to find out about next month's event, which is Dr. Francois Clemens, who we all know lovingly as Officer Clemens from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he's got a memoir out called Officer Clemens, so that should be a great night. And yeah, if you want copies of Berlin, we've got them at the shop. And I'm sure that Jason would come and sign one for you. So we hope to hear from you soon, and we hope everybody has a great night.
And people can mail order from the shop, right, Carrie?
Yes, yeah, that's that website.
Support your local indie bookstore.
Yes, please, thank you.
Great, thank you,
All right.
Carrie. Thanks for being on for this, and thank Christian also for running back up with you there. And thanks to all the Bookstock folks and to everybody who showed up. Really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
you.